You know, you hear stories about nightmare HOAs, the petty tyrants drunk on the thimbleful of power they've been given, but you never think it's going to be your HOA, or that they'd be stupid enough to physically assault a pregnant woman, the county sheriff no less, over a completely fabricated no fat people rule. When my wife Sarah, her badge and guns safely tucked away as she enjoyed a simple neighborhood walk, was accosted and then shoved by their ridiculous excuse for a security guard, a man we'd later know as Gary Pullman. They didn't just cross a line. They pole vaulted over it into a chasm of legal and personal ruin. They thought they were untouchable. They found out just how wrong they were when those courtroom doors slammed shut behind them, each carrying a new title, inmate. It started, as these things often do, with a sense of creeping unease in our otherwise quiet, well-maintained neighborhood. A place we'd chosen for its peace, its good schools, and the promise of a serene environment to raise our soon-to-be-born child. Sarah was about 5 months pregnant at the time, just starting to really show, and daily walks were her sanctuary, a way to combat the aches and fatigue, to breathe fresh air and clear her head from the pressures of being the county's top cop. We'd lived in the prestigious Oaks, if you can believe the gall, community for 3 years without so much as a parking ticket from the HOA, just polite nods to neighbors and the occasional generic newsletter about lawn care. Then came the new HOA board, swept in on a wave of promises about enhancing community standards and protecting property values, a common refrain that usually translated to making everyone miserable with nitpicky rules. Their first major act was hiring their own community standards officer, Gary Pullman, a man whose previous experience seemed to be limited to being a mall cop with an overinflated ego. He strutted around in a vaguely police-like uniform, dark navy shirt, pants with a stripe, a shiny badge that, upon closer inspection, read Prestigious Oaks Community Patrol, and a utility belt that held a notepad, a flashlight, and an air of unearned authority. He'd taken to driving an old golf cart, also painted navy blue, with a flashing yellow light on top, like some sort of dystopian ice cream man of misery. We'd seen him hassling kids for skateboarding on the sidewalk, measuring people's grass with a ruler, and leaving passive-aggressive notes on cars parked for more than an hour in front of their own homes. Annoying, yes, but we figured he was just another overzealous functionary we could largely ignore. We were wrong. The incident with Sarah happened on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. I was working from home, expecting her back around 3. She was later than usual, and when she finally walked in, her face was pale, and her eyes, usually so calm and analytical, were flashing with a mixture of disbelief and cold fury. She sank onto the sofa, one hand protectively cradling her belly. "You are not going to believe what just happened," she said, her voice tight. She recounted how, on the far side of the community park, near the old oak tree that was technically HOA common property, Gary Pullman had zipped up beside her in his golf cart, effectively blocking her path. He'd climbed out, puffed up his chest, and demanded to know what she was doing. Sarah, ever polite, had replied she was just out for her daily walk. That's when Gary's eyes had narrowed, raking her up and down, lingering pointedly on her pregnant belly. "Ma'am," he'd apparently sneered, "this is a no-fat community. We have appearance standards here. You're, exceeding the acceptable girth." Sarah had stared at him, dumbfounded, momentarily speechless that anyone could be so utterly offensive and idiotic. "I beg your pardon?" she'd managed. "Are you actually suggesting my pregnancy violates some HOA rule?" Gary, bless his ignorant heart, had puffed up even more. "Look, lady, rules are rules. We're trying to maintain a certain aesthetic. Your condition is a bit much. This isn't the place for unsightly displays." He'd actually waved a hand dismissively at her belly. Sarah, still processing the sheer audacity, had tried to explain that she was pregnant, a resident, and that his comment was not only absurd, but deeply offensive. She started to walk around him, intending to report his lunacy to the HOA management company immediately. That's when he'd escalated. He grabbed her arm hard. "Hey, I'm not done talking to you," he'd barked. Sarah tried to pull away, saying, "Take your hands off me." And that's when he shoved her. Not a gentle push, but a forceful shove to her shoulder that made her stumble sideways. She didn't fall. Her training and innate balance kept her upright, but she felt a jolt, a flash of fear for the baby, and then pure, cold rage. She'd fixed him with a look I knew well, the one that usually preceded someone ending up in handcuffs, and said in a low, dangerous voice, "You just made a very serious mistake." Gary, probably misinterpreting her quiet fury for fear or submission, had merely smirked. "Just follow the rules, ma'am, and we won't have any problems. Consider this a verbal warning." Then he'd climbed back into his golf cart and trundled off, leaving Sarah shaking with anger and a sudden, sharp pain in her arm where he'd grabbed her. My own fury was immediate and volcanic. This wasn't just an insult. This was assault. Assault on my pregnant wife. By an imbecile playing cop for an HOA that seemed to be cultivating its own little fiefdom of fools. "Did you get his name?" I asked, already mentally drafting a scathing letter and planning a visit to the HOA office. Sarah nodded. "Oh, I got his name, and I got a very good look at him." She took a deep breath. "Mike," she said, her voice now calm but with an underlying steel that I recognized as her professional game face. "This isn't just an HOA complaint anymore. He physically assaulted me. And that no-fat community nonsense? That's discrimination, plain and simple, not to mention utterly unhinged." I went to the kitchen, got her an ice pack for her arm, which was already showing the faint beginnings of a bruise where Gary's fingers had dug in. "We need to document this," she said, more to herself than to me. "I'll make an appointment with Dr. Evans for tomorrow morning, just to be safe, and to get this officially noted." The sheer stupidity of it all was mind-boggling. A no-fat community. In what universe was that a defensible or even conceivable policy? And even if it were some unspoken, ridiculous preference of the board to have their goon physically enforce it on a pregnant woman, it was beyond parody. The initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a grim determination. They had picked a fight with the wrong people. Gary Pullman and the prestigious Oaks HOA had no idea the hornet's nest they'd just kicked. We weren't just going to complain. We were going to dismantle their little kingdom of idiocy, piece by offensive piece. That evening, the air in our house was thick with a mixture of quiet anger and strategic planning. Sarah, true to her training, began to meticulously note down every detail of the encounter. The time, the exact location, Gary's exact words, the sequence of physical actions, his appearance, the details of his ridiculous golf cart. I researched the HOA's management company and the names of the current board members, a list easily found on the community website, under a typically bland Meet Your Boards section, featuring smiling photos of individuals who, I suspected, had no idea what their pet patrolman had just unleashed. The president was a woman named Brenda Hatcher, whose smile in her photo seemed particularly smug. Little did Brenda know her reign as the queen of prestigious Oaks was about to encounter a serious constitutional crisis. We decided our first official step, after Sarah's doctor's visit, would be a formal, written complaint to the HOA board and the management company, detailing the assault and demanding Gary Pullman's immediate termination and a formal apology. We knew, even then, that it was unlikely to be that simple. People like Gary, and the HOAs that empower them, rarely back down without a fight. They were usually too insulated by their own sense of petty authority and the apathy of other residents. But this time, the apathy would not be a factor for them. Sarah wasn't just any resident. She was the sheriff, and while she would ensure every official procedure was followed to the letter, ethically and legally, the resources and knowledge at her disposal were considerable. The thought of Gary Pullman's face when he eventually realized who he'd assaulted brought a grim smile to my own. It wouldn't be pleasant for him. It wouldn't be pleasant for any of them. The next morning, Sarah saw Dr. Evans, who confirmed there was no immediate danger to the baby, much to our immense relief, but documented the bruising on her arm and Sarah's account of the assault and emotional distress. The doctor was appalled, professionally and personally, and her written report would become a crucial piece of our initial documentation. With that in hand, we drafted a very precise, very factual letter to the HOA board, canning the management company P Property Management. We laid out the events of the previous afternoon, quoting Gary Pullman's offensive remarks about the no-fat community and his unacceptable comments about Sarah's pregnancy, and detailed the physical assault, the grabbing of her arm, the shove. We attached a copy of Dr. Evans' initial findings. We demanded Gary Pullman's immediate dismissal, a formal written apology from the HOA board for his conduct and for the discriminatory premise of his harassment, and an assurance that no such community standards regarding personal appearance or body size existed or would ever be considered. We gave them 7 business days to respond substantively. We sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, and also emailed copies to the official HOA email address and the listed contact for P Management. Sarah, in her official capacity, was meticulously careful to keep her role as sheriff separate from her actions as a private citizen making a complaint. However, her inherent knowledge of procedure and evidence gathering was now fully engaged on a personal level. We anticipated a dismissive response, perhaps some corporate non-apology blaming a misunderstanding or claiming Gary was just doing his job. We underestimated their arrogance and stupidity. 3 days later, a letter arrived from P Property Management, signed by a drone named Mark Jenkins, Senior Community Manager. It was a masterpiece of corporate buck-passing and victim blaming. It stated that they had conferred with Mr. Pullman and reviewed the incident according to their investigation, which I imagined consisted of Jenkins asking Gary, "Did you do it?" and Gary saying, "Nah, she's crazy." Mr. Pullman was enforcing duly established community aesthetic guidelines, and that Sarah had become agitated and verbally aggressive when approached. It mentioned that Mr. Pullman gently guided her away from a sensitive landscaping area she was about to tread upon, and that any physical contact was incidental and initiated by her abrupt movements. It concluded by saying the HOA stood by Mr. Pullman's professionalism and suggested Sarah might benefit from reviewing the community bylaws to better understand her obligations as a resident. There was no mention of a no-fat community, no apology, just a veiled accusation that Sarah was the aggressor and a liar. I read it aloud, my voice shaking with rage. "Gently guided, sensitive landscaping? They're calling you aggressive?" Sarah listened, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then a small, grim smile touched her lips. "Well," she said quietly, "they've certainly made their position clear, and they've put it in writing. This is good." Good? I was ready to drive over to the PP office and have a very loud discussion with Mark Jenkins. "Good how?" I demanded. "They're doubling down, Mike," she explained, as if to a slightly slow deputy. They're not just defending him. They're endorsing his actions and his fabricated story. They're establishing a pattern of behavior and a clear institutional stance. This isn't just Gary Pullman, rogue employee, anymore. This is the HOA and their management company actively sanctioning assault and discrimination, and then lying about it. She tapped the letter. This document is evidence, not just of their poor judgment, but potentially of a conspiracy to cover up his actions and defame me. We realized we needed to escalate beyond just letters. The HOA board president, Brenda Hatcher, was clearly backing this nonsense. It was time to see if any of our neighbors had experienced similar harassment from Gary, perhaps not as physically aggressive, but part of a pattern. Sarah suggested a calm, methodical approach. We weren't going door-to-door ranting. We'd speak to a few trusted neighbors first, people we knew to be reasonable. Mrs. Henderson, a kind retiree from 2 doors down, was horrified when Sarah recounted the incident, omitting, for now, the full extent of Gary's fat comments to spare her blushes, just focusing on his aggression and the shove. "That Gary," she exclaimed. "He's a menace. Last week he yelled at my grandson for riding his tricycle too fast on the sidewalk. Called it reckless endangerment of community pathways. My little Timmy is 4. Another neighbor, Tom Berwick, a quiet engineer, admitted Gary had given him a written warning for his recycling bin being visibly overfilled the night before pickup, claiming it was an eyesore. He'd even photographed the bin as evidence. The stories started to paint a picture of a man drunk on minuscule power, enabled by an HOA board that either didn't care or actively encouraged his reign of terror. No one else reported physical assault, but the pattern of harassment, intimidation, and absurd rule enforcement was undeniable. While we were doing this, the HOA, clearly feeling emboldened by their own dismissive letter, decided to up the ante. We received an official notice of violation from Prestigious Oaks. It wasn't about Sarah's walk. It was about the small, decorative wreath on our front door. A tasteful, seasonal item. The notice claimed it violated a previously unheard-of rule against non-approved door adornments and gave us 48 hours to remove it or face a 50 fine, escalating daily. It was so transparently retaliatory it was almost laughable if it weren't so infuriating. "They're trying to intimidate us," I said, crumpling the notice. "They think a little fine will make us back off from the assault complaint." Sarah took the notice, smoothed it out. "More evidence," she said calmly. "Retaliation. Harassment. This is a pattern of conduct." She then looked up our community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CCRs, and the bylaws, which we had, of course, received when we bought the house. She spent an evening meticulously reading through every single page, highlighting sections, making notes. There was, unsurprisingly, no rule against tasteful door wreaths. There was also, and this was critical, absolutely nothing about appearance standards for residents. No fat community clause. No mention of acceptable girth. The only aesthetic guidelines pertained to property, lawn height, paint colors, approved fencing. What Gary Pullman had spouted, and what PP management had implicitly backed, was a complete fabrication, a vile invention used to justify his assault. The lines were being drawn more clearly now. This wasn't just about one thug. It was about an entire HOA system that was, at best, grossly negligent and, at worst, actively malicious and discriminatory. Sarah began to prepare a more comprehensive file, her professional instincts taking over. She compiled her doctor's report, our initial complaint letter, the HOA's insulting response, the retaliatory wreath violation, witness statements from Mrs. Henderson and Tom Berwick, who were happy to provide them in writing, now that they knew they weren't alone, and her detailed analysis of the CCRs. "I think," Sarah said after a couple of days of this quiet, intense activity, "it's time we requested a formal meeting with the HOA board, and I think Gary Pullman should be there." I raised an eyebrow. "You want to be in the same room as that creep again?" "Yes," she said, her eyes glinting. "I want them all together when they realize exactly who they've been messing with. I want to see their faces when the penny drops. And then, Mike, then we proceed with formal legal action, not just against Pullman, but against the HOA itself for creating and condoning this environment." The quiet confidence she exuded was formidable. The HOA thought they were dealing with just another disgruntled resident they could bully into submission. They were about to find out they'd picked a fight with the law itself in a very personal and direct way. Their petty kingdom was built on a foundation of ignorance and arrogance, and Sarah was about to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. Our request for a formal meeting with the HOA board, with Gary Pullman in attendance, was met with surprising alacrity. Brenda Hatcher, the HOA president, probably saw it as an opportunity to put us in our place, to reiterate their stance in person, and perhaps to enjoy our supposed discomfort. She probably imagined a scenario where she, flanked by her board and their loyal enforcer, would deliver a stern lecture to the troublesome residents. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening in the small, soulless community clubhouse meeting room. We arrived a few minutes early. Sarah was dressed in smart, casual attire, nothing that overtly screamed sheriff, but she carried an air of quiet authority that was palpable, at least to me. I was just trying to keep my temper in check. The room was set up with a long table at one end, where 3 board members were already seated. Brenda Hatcher in the middle, flanked by a nervous-looking man I vaguely recognized as Stan, the treasurer, and a stern-faced woman named Agnes, the secretary. Gary Pullman stood near the door, arms crossed, trying to look intimidating in his silly uniform. He shot Sarah a smirk as we entered, a smirk that I mentally bookmarked for later. P Management's drone, Mark Jenkins, was also present, sitting slightly behind Brenda, clutching a cheap-looking briefcase. Brenda Hatcher, a woman in her late 50s with aggressively styled blonde hair and an expression of perpetual disapproval, motioned us to 2 chairs placed a deferential distance from their table. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, thank you for coming," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "We understand you wish to discuss the recent unfortunate misunderstanding involving Mr. Pullman and Mrs. Miller." Misunderstanding. My jaw tightened. Sarah, however, remained perfectly composed. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Ms. Hatcher, members of the board, Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Pullman," Sarah said, her tone polite but firm. "To be clear, there was no misunderstanding. There was an unprovoked verbal and physical assault on me by Mr. Pullman predicated on a non-existent and discriminatory rule he cited." Gary scoffed audibly. Brenda Hatcher frowned. "Now, Mrs. Miller, Mr. Pullman has given us his account. He was performing his duties, ensuring community standards were upheld. He reported that you became quite agitated." "Agitated?" Sarah repeated, a dangerous calm in her voice. "Mr. Pullman accosted me, informed me I was too fat for this community due to my pregnancy, cited a no-fat community rule, and when I attempted to disengage from his offensive harassment, he grabbed my arm and shoved me. I have a doctor's report documenting the injuries. That is assault, Miss Hatcher." Mark Jenkins cleared his throat nervously. "Our position, as outlined in our letter, is that Miss Pullman's actions were misinterpreted and that any contact was minimal and incidental." I couldn't stay silent any longer. "Minimal and incidental? He bruised her arm. He shoved a pregnant woman. And this no-fat community rule? Show it to me. Show me where in the CC rupees it says my wife is too fat to walk in her own neighborhood. Stan, the treasurer, looked down at his hands. Agnes scribbled furiously on a notepad. Brenda Hatcher's smile became a thin, hard line. The aesthetic standards of prestigious oaks are implicitly understood, Mr. Miller. We expect residents to maintain a certain decorum. Mr. Pullman has our full support. In fact, we're more concerned about your recent retaliatory and unfounded complaints. And this wreath on your door, that is a clear violation. It was breathtaking. They weren't just defending him, they were proud of it. They were trying to turn it back on us. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping across each of them before settling on Brenda Hatcher. Ms. Hatcher, she began, her voice dropping to a level that commanded absolute attention. I am not just Mrs. Miller, resident. I am Sarah Miller. Perhaps you recognize the name. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Brenda's face. Gary Pullman still looked smug. Stan looked increasingly queasy. My full title, Sarah continued, enunciating each word with precision, is Sheriff Sarah Miller of the Sheridan County Sheriff's Department. The silence in the room was instantaneous and absolute. Gary Pullman's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror. His arms uncrossed, and he seemed to shrink slightly. Stan's mouth fell open. Agnes's pen froze mid-scribble. Mark Jenkins, from P actually gasped. A little squeaking sound. Brenda Hatcher's face went from smug to confused, then to a sickly shade of pale. Her eyes darted from Sarah to me, then back to Sarah, as if trying to process an impossible piece of information. Sheriff? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, Sheriff, Sarah confirmed, her eyes like chips of ice. And Mr. Pullman, your employee, or your board's agent, committed assault and battery upon my person. He did so while claiming to enforce a rule that does not exist and is, on its face, discriminatory. You, Ms. Hatcher, and this board, and P management through Mr. Jenkins, have not only condoned his actions, but have actively participated in a cover-up, have lied in official correspondence, and have engaged in retaliatory harassment by issuing bogus violation notices. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Mr. Pullman, Sarah said, turning her gaze directly to him. He was now visibly sweating, his eyes wide with panic. Your actions constitute criminal assault. Your uniform and badge, combined with your behavior, could also be construed as impersonating a law enforcement officer, depending on how you present yourself to the public. We'll certainly be looking into that. Gary started to stammer. I didn't. I mean, I was just... You were just assaulting a citizen. Sarah cut him off coldly. A pregnant citizen, who happens to be the chief law enforcement officer of this county. She then turned back to the board. Ms. Hatcher, Ms. Jenkins, your letter defending Mr. Pullman and slandering me is now evidence. Your retaliatory wreath violation is evidence. The testimony of other residents harassed by Mr. Pullman, which we have gathered, is evidence. You have created a hostile environment, sanctioned illegal activity, and misused HOA funds if you are paying Mr. Pullman to behave in this manner. This goes far beyond an HOA dispute. This is a criminal matter, and potentially a significant civil rights issue. Brenda Hatcher finally found her voice, though it was shaky. Now, Sheriff Miller, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. We had no idea. Of course, we don't condone any illegal activity. Perhaps we were misinformed by Mr. Pullman. Gary looked like he'd been punched in the gut. Brenda, you told me to be tough. You said we needed to clean up the neighborhood's image. he blurted out, a desperate edge to his voice. Brenda shot him a murderous glare, which he missed as he was looking pleadingly at Sarah. "Silence, Gary," she hissed. Mark Jenkins was frantically whispering something to Brenda, probably advising immediate and total capitulation. Sarah held up a hand. "Ms. Hatcher, your attempts to backtrack now are noted, but frankly, it's too late. Mr. Pullman will be facing criminal charges for assault. My office will be investigating his conduct thoroughly, including any potential impersonation, and the actions of this board and PP management will also be subject to intense scrutiny. The district attorney's office will be very interested in your aesthetic guidelines and your methods of enforcement." She stood up, and I followed suit. "This meeting is over. You will be hearing from my attorney regarding the civil aspects, and you will certainly be hearing from the district attorney's office regarding the criminal ones. I suggest you all retain competent legal counsel. You're going to need it." The expressions on their faces were a cocktail of fear, disbelief, and the dawning realization that their little reign of terror was not just over, but was about to bring down a world of trouble upon their heads. Gary Pullman looked like he was about to be physically sick. Brenda Hatcher seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. As we walked out of that clubhouse, leaving them in stunned, horrified silence, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The first domino had fallen. The rest of them were about to come crashing down, and it was going to be spectacular. They had grossly underestimated the quiet, pregnant woman they'd decided to bully. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about true authority and the consequences of abusing their imaginary version of it. The fresh evening air outside the clubhouse felt cleaner, as if we'd just lanced a boil. The days following that explosive HOA meeting were a whirlwind of official activity, all meticulously handled with an eye towards absolute legal propriety. True to her word, Sarah immediately recused herself from any direct operational involvement in the investigation or prosecution of Gary Pullman or the HOA board members to avoid any conflict of interest or appearance thereof. However, she briefed her chief deputy, a seasoned and highly competent officer named Frank Ramirez, on the full situation, emphasizing that the case needed to be handled strictly by the book, but with the seriousness it warranted. Frank, a man who had seen his share of unbelievable behavior, was nevertheless stunned by the sheer gall of Pullman and the HOA. He assured Sarah it would be pursued vigorously. The district attorney for Sheridan County, a no-nonsense prosecutor named Eleanor Vance, was formally notified. When DA Vance received the preliminary file, Sarah's sworn affidavit, Dr. Sarah's, Evan's medical report, photos of the bruises, copies of the HOA's incriminating letters, the bogus wreath violation, and the initial witness statements from other harassed residents, her reaction was reportedly one of incredulous fury. "They did what to the sheriff? Over a no-fat rule?" she was quoted as saying by Frank, who had delivered the file. Eleanor Vance was not known for her tolerance of bullies, or those who abused positions of power, however minor. Within a week, the wheels of justice began to grind. Gary Pullman was formally arrested by 2 of Sarah's deputies. A deliberately by-the-book, almost low-key arrest to avoid any claims of vindictiveness, though I'm sure the deputies enjoyed it. He was charged with assault in the 3rd degree and harassment in the 2nd degree. The charge of impersonating an officer was held in abeyance, pending further investigation into his uniform, badge, and public conduct, but it hung over him like a sword of Damocles. Pullman, looking considerably less smug in his mugshot, spent a night in county lockup before managing to make bail, which was set surprisingly high for such charges, likely reflecting the DA's view of his arrogance and the vulnerability of his victim. Simultaneously, DA Vance launched a broader investigation into the prestigious Oaks HOA board, specifically President Brenda Hatcher, Treasurer Stan Lekowitz, and Secretary Agnes Periwinkle, and P Property Management. Her office began issuing subpoenas for all HOA meeting minutes, financial records, correspondence related to community standards enforcement, and any employment records or contracts related to Gary Pullman. They wanted to see if there was a pattern of approving or encouraging Pullman's aggressive tactics, if HOA funds were being misused to support his personal vendetta machine, and if the board had knowingly allowed a hostile environment to fester. They were particularly interested in Pullman's blurted statement at the meeting. "Brenda, you told me to be tough. You said we needed to clean up the neighborhood's image." This suggested direct complicity from Hatcher. We, in parallel, retained a sharp civil attorney, a woman named Claire Rourke, known for her tenacity in HOA disputes and civil rights cases. Claire was thrilled with the case, not just because of the high profile it was beginning to attract locally, but because of the sheer brazenness of the HOA's actions. "They've gift-wrapped this for us," Claire said, reviewing Sarah's meticulously prepared file. "The letter from P alone is a gold mine. They put their stupidity in writing. And Sheriff, your composure and documentation are impeccable." Claire began drafting a formidable civil lawsuit against Pullman, the HOA board members individually, P Management, and the HOA as an entity. The suit alleged assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation, for the letter claiming Sarah was aggressive, discrimination based on familial status, pregnancy, and creating a hostile living environment. The damages we were seeking were substantial, but more importantly, we sought injunctive relief to force systemic changes in how the HOA operated and to ensure no resident would ever face such harassment again. The HOA, predictably, went into meltdown. Brenda Hatcher, Stan Lekowitz, and Agnes Periwinkle hired a surprisingly expensive law firm from the city, an indication of just how terrified they were. P Management brought in their own corporate counsel. Their initial strategy seemed to be a combination of denial, deflection, and delay. Their lawyers filed motions to dismiss, claiming immunity for board members acting in their official capacity, a laughable defense given the nature of the allegations, and arguing that Pullman was an independent contractor for whose actions they weren't responsible, despite their previous letter stating he had their full support. The local rumor mill, of course, went into overdrive. News of the sheriff being assaulted by an HOA enforcer over a fat rule spread like wildfire through our town, and even made some regional news outlets, usually with a tone of amused disbelief at the HOA's audacity. Most neighbors were incredibly supportive, many sharing their own minor horror stories about Gary Pullman and the increasingly tyrannical board. A few, however, were HOA loyalists, grumbling about standards and how Sarah was using her position to get special treatment, conveniently ignoring that the initial assault happened when no one knew her position and that any citizen deserved not to be assaulted. Sarah handled the public scrutiny with her usual grace, making no public statements beyond what was necessary for official proceedings, emphasizing her role as a private citizen, seeking justice through the proper legal channels. The stress was undeniable, though. Pregnancy is stressful enough without adding criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, and being the subject of local gossip. But Sarah was a rock. Her determination to see this through, not just for herself but for the principle of it, was unwavering. She often said, "If they can do this to the county sheriff, imagine what they feel they can get away with doing to anyone else. This has to stop," comprehensively. The investigation by the DA's office began to unearth some truly rotten practices within the prestigious Oaks OA. It turned out Brenda Hatcher had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, with Stan and Agnes as her compliant, if sometimes reluctant, enablers. There were questionable expenditures, minutes of meetings that seemed to be retroactively altered, and a clear pattern of targeting residents who dared to question Brenda's edicts. Gary Pullman, it was discovered, had a history of similar complaints in a previous security job, a fact the HOA board, in its wisdom, had either not discovered or chosen to ignore during his hiring. His training consisted of Brenda telling him to make prestigious Oaks the most admired community in the county, no matter what it takes. The no-fat community line, it seemed, was Gary's own particularly vile invention, born from a twisted interpretation of Brenda's vague directives about maintaining an upscale aesthetic. But the board had certainly never corrected him or reined in his other excesses, effectively ratifying his behavior through their inaction and, later, their explicit support after he assaulted Sarah. The legal machinery, though sometimes slow, was grinding inexorably towards a reckoning. The HOA's attempts to wriggle out of responsibility were failing. Their lawyers looked increasingly stressed in preliminary hearings. Gary Pullman seemed utterly deflated, his swagger gone. Brenda Hatcher, however, maintained an air of defiant indignation, at least publicly, though sources said she was privately panicking. The stage was being set for a courtroom showdown that promised to be both dramatic and deeply satisfying. We weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were fighting for every resident who had ever been bullied by an overzealous HOA with a dictator complex. And we were not going to hesitate. The first to face the music was Gary Pullman. His criminal trial for assault and harassment was scheduled relatively quickly, the DA likely wanting to make an example and send a clear message. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Local media were present, along with a surprising number of prestigious Oaks residents, their faces a mixture of curiosity and grim anticipation. Gary, seated next to his beleaguered public defender, looked small and anxious, a far cry from the puffed-up bully who had confronted Sarah. The prosecution, led by ADA Mark Phillips from DA Vance's office, laid out the case simply and damningly. Sarah was their star witness. She recounted the events of that afternoon with calm, professional clarity, her voice never wavering. She described Gary's words, his tone, his aggression, the exact nature of the physical contact, and the fear she had felt, not just for herself, but for her unborn child. When she spoke of his no-fat community remark and his dismissive gesture towards her pregnancy, a wave of revulsion rippled through the courtroom. Her testimony was backed by Dr. Evans' medical report and photographs of the bruises on her arm. Even Gary's defense attorney seemed to struggle during cross-examination. He tried to paint Sarah as overly sensitive, as misinterpreting Gary's intentions, as perhaps being hormonal due to her pregnancy. A truly idiotic line of questioning that earned him a sharp rebuke from the judge and audible scoffs from the gallery. Sarah dismantled his insinuations with quiet dignity and unwavering factual recall. "Counselor," she stated firmly at one point, "being pregnant does not impair my ability to recognize an assault. Being pregnant does not make it acceptable for someone to put their hands on me. And being pregnant certainly does not give anyone license to refer to me or any other human being as too fat to exist in a public space." The defense's main argument was that Gary was just doing his job, as he understood it, that he was trying to enforce community standards, and that any physical contact was accidental or a result of Sarah resisting his legitimate instructions. This fell apart spectacularly when Ada Phillips presented Gary's own initial written statement to PP Management, the one where he claimed Sarah was agitated and he had gently guided her. This statement, full of self-serving lies, directly contradicted his new defense of accidental contact. Phillips also brought up Gary's previous job history and the similar complaints, painting a clear picture of a man with a pattern of overstepping authority and aggressive behavior. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict: guilty on both counts. Assault in the 3rd degree and harassment in the 2nd degree. Gary Pullman slumped in his chair, his face ashen. Sentencing was a week later. The judge, a stern, experienced jurist named Maria Sanchez, listened to the ADA's recommendation for jail time, citing the unprovoked nature of the attack, the vulnerability of the victim, Pullman's utter lack of remorse until convicted, and the need to send a message that such behavior would not be tolerated. Pullman's attorney pleaded for probation, citing his lack of a prior criminal record and his supposed remorse now that he was facing actual consequences. Judge Sanchez was unmoved. "Mr. Pullman," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "you were entrusted with a modicum of authority by your employers, and you abused it in a vile and physically aggressive manner. Your comments to Sheriff Miller were not just offensive, they were dehumanizing. You assaulted a pregnant woman. The fact that your victim happens to be the county sheriff is incidental to the crime itself, but perhaps indicative of your profound arrogance and misjudgment. This community will not tolerate bullies who hide behind a flimsy badge and a fabricated set of rules." She sentenced Gary Pullman to 90 days in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and a permanent injunction preventing him from ever working in any security or enforcement capacity within Sheridan County again. A collective gasp, followed by quiet murmurs of approval, went through the courtroom. Pullman was led away in handcuffs, finally looking like the defeated thug he was. His chapter was closed. Next came the broader case against the HOA board members, Brenda Hatcher, Stan Lekowitz, and Agnes Periwinkle, and by extension, the HOA itself. The DA's office had gathered a mountain of evidence. It turned out that Brenda Hatcher hadn't just told Gary to be tough. She'd actively encouraged a campaign of petty tyranny, reveling in the complaints about his effectiveness in making people follow the rules. There was an email trail where she'd praised Gary for his proactive approach after he'd had an elderly resident's car towed for being parked with one tire slightly on their own grass. Financial records showed irregularities, small amounts siphoned off for board expenses that coincided with personal shopping trips for Brenda. Stan and Agnes, while not the primary instigators, had been willingly complicit, signing off on Brenda's directives and Pullman's dubious timesheets, and actively participating in the cover-up and the retaliatory actions against us. DA Vance's office decided to offer Stan and Agnes a deal, plead guilty to lesser charges, cooperate fully against Brenda Hatcher, and detail the HOA's operational malfeasance, and they might avoid jail time, though significant fines and community service were still on the table. After a week of agonizing, Stan Lekowitz cracked. He couldn't face the prospect of a lengthy trial and potential prison. He took the deal, providing a wealth of incriminating testimony and documentation against Brenda. Agnes Periwinkle, seeing Stan fold, followed suit shortly thereafter. Their cooperation painted an even uglier picture of Brenda Hatcher's reign. She had systematically silenced dissent, manipulated votes, and used HOA funds and Gary Pullman as her personal instruments of power and intimidation. The charge of impersonating an officer for Pullman was revisited, and while not directly applicable for jail time as he didn't overtly claim to be police, his uniform's close resemblance to law enforcement, combined with his aggressive enforcement, led to further sanctions against the HOA for allowing such misrepresentation. The main criminal charges against Brenda Hatcher now included misappropriation of HOA funds, a felony, conspiracy to commit harassment, and official misconduct related to her abuse of her HOA position. P management, eager to distance themselves from the toxic mess, settled their part of our civil suit quickly, paying a hefty sum and terminating their contract with prestigious Oaks. They also fired Mark Jenkins, whose incompetent and sycophantic handling of our initial complaint had been a key factor in their liability. Brenda Hatcher, however, remained defiant, convinced she was the victim of a vendetta. Her expensive lawyers fought tooth and nail, but the evidence, bolstered by Stan and Agnes's testimony, was overwhelming. Her trial was longer and more complex than Pullman's, delving into the murky finances and petty politics of the HOA. The jury found her guilty on all significant counts. At her sentencing, Brenda Hatcher finally broke down, tearfully begging the judge for leniency, claiming she was just trying to make the community better and had been under a lot of stress. Judge Sanchez, the same judge who had sentenced Pullman, was having none of it. "Hatcher," she stated, her voice like granite, "you were not making the community better. You were terrorizing it. You fostered an environment of fear and intimidation. You abused the trust of your neighbors and misappropriated their funds. Your actions, and those of the board members you manipulated or who willingly followed you, brought disgrace upon your community and inflicted genuine harm. You and your cohort decided to target a resident for harassment, culminating in an assault. And when confronted, you chose lies and retaliation. This was not a momentary lapse. This was a sustained campaign of abuse of power." Judge Sanchez then delivered sentences that sent shockwaves through every HOA in the county. Stan Lekowitz and Agnes Periwinkle, due to their cooperation, received hefty fines, lengthy probation, extensive community service, and were barred from ever serving on an HOA board again. But for Brenda Hatcher, there was no such leniency. She was sentenced to 18 months in state prison for the felony misappropriation and concurrent sentences for the other charges. The courtroom was stunned into silence, then erupted into murmurs. The message was clear. Abusing HOA power could lead to actual, hard jail time. They all got a jail sentence, in one form or another of restriction of liberty or direct incarceration, tailored to their culpability. Justice had not just been served, it had been delivered with a sledgehammer. The aftermath of the trials and sentencings was profound, both for us personally and for the prestigious Oaks community. With Gary Pullman serving his time, and Brenda Hatcher, Stan Lekowitz, and Agnes Periwinkle removed from power and facing their respective penalties, Brenda's being the most severe with actual prison, a massive power vacuum opened up in the HOA. The remaining, mostly bewildered residents had to scramble to form an interim board, individuals who were, thankfully, far more reasonable and shell-shocked by what their predecessors had wrought. The HOA's finances were a mess, depleted by Brenda's peculations and the enormous legal fees incurred defending the indefensible. Our civil suit, which P management had already settled their portion of, continued against the HOA entity itself and the now convicted former board members. Given their criminal convictions, their liability in the civil case was practically a foregone conclusion. Claire Rourke negotiated a substantial settlement from the HOA's insurance, which was just barely adequate, and from the personal assets of Brenda, Stan, and Agnes that could be attached. A significant portion of this settlement we designated to go into an audited HOA reserve fund, specifically for community improvements and to lower dues for a year, as a way of giving back to the neighbors who had also suffered under the old regime, albeit less directly. We kept enough to cover our own legal fees, medical expenses, though minor, thankfully, and a modest sum for the distress and disruption to our lives, particularly during Sarah's pregnancy. The remaining funds were donated to a local charity supporting victims of domestic abuse and bullying, a cause close to Sarah's heart. The no-fat community rule, or rather, Gary's insane invention of it, became a dark joke within prestigious Oaks, a cautionary tale whispered at neighborhood barbecues. The infamous wreath violation notice was framed and hung in our downstairs bathroom, a reminder of the absurd depths of their pettiness. Our door wreath, by the way, stayed up, and soon many other doors in the neighborhood sported similar tasteful adornments, a quiet symbol of defiance and newfound freedom. The community clubhouse meeting room, site of Sarah's dramatic reveal, was quietly renamed the Liberty Room by the new interim board, a nod to the changes that had been forced upon them. The new board, learning from the mistakes of the old, immediately contracted a reputable professional management company with strict oversight protocols. They revised the bylaws to include clearer checks and balances, transparency requirements for financial dealings, and explicit protections against harassment and discrimination by any HOA official or employee. They even instituted mandatory ethics training for all future board members. It was a long road to recovery for prestigious Oaks, but the changes were palpable. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. Neighbors started talking to each other more, the fear of arbitrary enforcement gone. Kids played more freely. The ridiculous navy blue golf cart was sold for scrap. On a personal level, the resolution brought immense relief. Sarah's pregnancy continued smoothly, and a few months after Brenda Hatcher's sentencing, our beautiful, healthy daughter, Emily, was born. Holding her, all the stress and anger of the preceding months seemed to melt away, replaced by joy and an even fiercer determination to ensure she grew up in a world where bullies didn't win. The ordeal had been taxing, no doubt, but it had also reaffirmed our faith in the justice system, when pursued with diligence and integrity, and the importance of standing up to abuse of power, no matter how seemingly small the abuser's domain. Sarah, despite being the catalyst for this massive upheaval, never gloated. She returned her duties as sheriff with her usual quiet competence, but there was a new level of respect for her in the county, not just as a law enforcement officer, but as someone who had faced down personal injustice and triumphed through the system she represented. Occasionally, we'd drive past the Sheridan County Correctional Facility where Gary Pullman was finishing his relatively short sentence, or hear news about Brenda Hatcher navigating life in the state penitentiary system. There was no joy in their incarceration, only a grim satisfaction that consequences had finally caught up with actions. They had begged for mercy in court, pleaded that their lives would be ruined, that they had made mistakes, but their mistakes had been deliberate choices, patterns of behavior that harmed others. We did not hesitate to ensure they faced the full measure of the law, because leniency in the face of such calculated malice and arrogance would have been a disservice to ourselves and to the community they lorded over. They all got a jail sentence, a truth that resonated far beyond our little neighborhood, serving as a stark warning to other petty tyrants in other HOAs. Justice, in this case, was not just blind. It was definitive and, for those who had wronged us, utterly life-altering. The peace in prestigious Oaks was hard won, but it was real. A testament to the fact that even the most entrenched bullies can be brought down when people, especially one very capable and underestimated sheriff, decide enough is enough.